Welcome. Thank you to everybody that's in the room. Thank you to everyone that's joining us both through Facebook Live and through Zoom. So our speaker series is called The State of California's Changing Electorate, and it is sponsored by the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund and presented by our research center, the Center for Inclusive Democracy at the USC Price School of Public Policy. That's a mouthful. The series itself, if you haven't seen any of our, or have attended any of the sessions yet, it's a series really examining voter access in California, its elections, of course, and the impact that the changing makeup, right, that's had on the changing makeup of California. We know that California, by many respects, has been very forward in its both adoption and implementation of election reforms, and in its consideration of the changing electorate, changing demographics in the state, but also additional increasing ever so calls for what we hope to see is a representative electorate, right? One that where the makeup of the electorate, those who are actually casting a ballot, actually looks like and hopefully matches up to the demographics of our state, the makeup of the population of California. Through the series, we have tackled a number of topics. Today, of course, is California redistricting, but we've also looked at, speaking of election reforms, automatic voter registration. We've had a great session looking at turnout, the state of turnout in California, as well as representation. And we had a data presentation, but also a panel talking about both the opportunities that we see going forward, but also the challenges, right, in terms of seeing that representative electorate. We have other future topics beyond today. We're going to be talking about language access in California's electorate, as well as looking back at the Voters' Choice Act. If you're not familiar with that, that is I used to always say a new election system, but it's actually not new. It's about 5 years old in California, 5 years since adoption, and about over half the state's registered voter population lives in a county that's adopted the Voters' Choice Act, and we're just going to be looking to see, kind of at the 5-year point, roughly, what does it look like, right? The impact of the electorate. So today, I'm going to speak just really briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Christian Grose, who is a colleague of mine at USC's Price School of Public Policy, and also the Poli-Sci department, and a nationally recognized scholar on redistricting. And then we have a panel, which will include Christian, as well as Helen Hutchison from the California League of Women Voters, as well as Sietse Goffard, the Senior Program Coordinator of Voting Rights, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and ALC. I mentioned already the former and future sessions. I did not mention formerly incarcerated in voting. We've also had a session on that as well as research that we put out. And just briefly, giving you maybe a little bit better sense of the goals of this series is we hope that it's educational. We know that there's a lot of new staff, excitingly so, right, in the legislature, and a lot of new members that maybe have not been yet had the opportunity, at least, to really dive into elections, democracy-related, particularly elections-related topics in California. And so we present this series as something that people can attend in person, they can attend virtually, but also there'll be a library on our website, there already is for our previous sessions, recorded that at any time, right, you want to re-examine a topic that we've covered, a new session, or a session that we've covered previously, or you want to share it with a new staff member or a colleague or anyone, there's going to be a library, and in a sense, all these topics for people to revisit, to share, to learn from, to ask questions, to reconnect with us, right? And challenge anything that we've covered or any of our speakers have covered as well. And we're always open to that. We want engagement. That's who we are as a research center. And we've long given talks at the Capitol. It's really about dissemination of the work and dialogue with the work. Okay, but it's not just about us. So since this is an educational series, we want you to know that there's other places you can get data. This is not a complete list, but this is a pretty good list. The Public Policy Institute of California, again under the democracy space. UCLA Latino Politics and Policy Institute, the Yankovic Center, which I know Thad Kauser is around here today somewhere. He runs that or co-runs it. And then of course, data from the Current Population Survey with its challenges is available always at your fingertips. And then data at least from voter file, certainly from PDI, Catalyst, Data for Social Good, other organizations. Just depends on what you're looking for and what you're needing. Multiple sources. From our center, we have a lot of research coming out. Just really briefly, just to let you know, turnout, voting methods, outreach, ballot tracks use in California, voter experience, indigenous voters, continued research around formerly incarcerated, and so forth. Always look on be on the outlook or look out for that. And then, because of time, I won't get into this, but just to remind folks, if you haven't seen that in a while, or maybe if you don't know about it, let you know for the first time, we've got data tools on our website, cid.usc.edu. We have mapped every inch of the state, every county and every inch in the state, and as well as many, many states across the country. Our voting location and outreach tool gives you two things. One is to suggest accessible, equitably placed voting locations in jurisdictions across California. It also does that in every other state that it's in and functions in, but it also gives you a ton of data that you can use for outreach, voter education purposes, mobilization, nonpartisan, all sorts of purposes that we never thought of. It's about democratizing data. You can look at voter history, you can look at transit stops, you can look at vehicle access, you can look at LEP, whatever it might be. So that's available to you as well. So let's talk about redistricting. So I'm sure everybody knows here in this room, if you're here today, that redistricting efforts, right, are required by the US Constitution. Can ensure the idea that districts reflect shifts and growth in their populations, right, to avoid things like vote dilution. One person, one vote is a constitutional requirement that requires each district to substantially equal in total population. But how that is done, right, is a different story. We're not going to, in our short time today, tackle everything, but we are going to give you a sense of what's happening in California, pay a lot of attention to the California's Redistricting Commission, Independent Redistricting Commission, and talk about what we need to do going forward, and that's really what our panelists will be talking about today. So I won't get into this in depth, but just to say that in the redistricting process, right, you can still, obviously you want to avoid vote dilution, and you can see vote dilution. There's things like cracking, stacking, and packing. There are lots of conscious and some argue not so conscious attempts, but period, the outcome of redistricting can lead to a suppression of a vote, or at least vote dilution in some form. We're going to make the slides available later, so if you are interested in some of those definitions. If you are concerned about vote dilution and want to avoid vote dilution in whatever form exactly it is, there's three main buckets, right, to address that. Litigation, right, and we see that across the country, and we've seen that in California as well. Citizens, residents can take power to put pressure or give guidance to those that are making decisions around the redistricting process. California, again, a good example of that is what we eventually developed, which was the Independent Redistricting Commission. And you can mobilize, right, voters to overcome barriers, literally voting in different representation at your local state level. But that is difficult because we know that there can be a relationship certainly between the makeup of districts in terms of how that may encourage or discourage people from turning out to vote. But period, we have quite substantially, and this is nothing new, historically and currently today, disparities in turnout by race, ethnicity, age, disability status, language status, the list goes on. And that's part of the conversation in redistricting in terms of who is making the decision around the decision makers, right? And who is just engaged on the topic, period. And it is a topic that is loose and amorphous and puzzling, and some used to say not so sexy, gerrymandering, like what's gerrymandering? I think we've seen an evolution, if you will, in the last 10 years, particularly in this country. More and more people have heard of the concept of gerrymandering. More and more people have heard of the broader concept of redistricting. They know it's important, but still for the vast majority of the public, I would argue, how do you get involved, why it matters, the details around it, right? A lot of people find it difficult to track. And education, advocacy, informed policy making, right, or policy makers are just really critical. But again, our panel will talk more about that. So this is a little bit about the Redistricting Commission itself. I know Christian's going to talk about that, so I just included a slide so we just have it. But just really quickly, just to set the stage before I hand it over to Christian, we know that, right, we want a representative electorate, we want representative, right, hopefully districts. But what does California really look like? And there's a lot of assumptions, right, around not only at a state level, our population, but also its distribution, right? What does it really look like? How many Latinos are in California? What does the Black population look like? Getting and having accurate data just at a population level is critically important, right? To make sure that we're not working off of misinformation and we hope not disinformation, right? So just really quickly, if you didn't know, California's population is still growing, is projected by 2020 and 2040 to continue to grow. And in the redistricting conversation within the state, of course, it's all about the makeup, right? The makeup of jurisdictions. What does that look like? So here, just at a state level, and these are data from the California Department of Finance, population numbers. Just want to show you of the makeup of the population, right? Proportionally what it looks like, but for the largest racial and ethnic groups, so white, Latino, you can't see Black is purple, Asian is green, and other, forgive the category, but everyone else is blue. In 2020, 39.5% of the overall total population in California, Latino. By 2040, 43%. White, starting at 36%. If you didn't know, Latinos are the plurality of the population in California. Down to 31. Asian Americans staying roughly steady, a slight increase. But this is the proportional story, so I want to emphasize there's tremendous growth expected within the Asian American population, and some subgroups more than others. But when we talk about the proportional story, right, you see it a little bit less there, but still significant. And the Black population proportionally staying about steady in California. If we look at citizen voting age population, just really quickly, we start off in 2020 with whites being a larger. If you can't see in the back, it's 43.6% in 2020 of the citizen voting age. That's the eligible voter population. That is white. Latino is 30%, Asian American is 13%, and Black is a little bit higher here at 6.6%. Right, but coming together in 2040 for white and Latino and staying fairly steady, again, proportionally for Blacks and Asian Americans. But if I had more time, this is not that kind of talk, but I could break this out right by county. And we certainly know, if you think just of the Latino population in the state, some counties, right, above 50% easily. Other counties in the single digits, right? More proportionally in the South and the Central Valley for Latinos, much lower, right, proportionally in the rest of the state. Black population also is distributed, right, in certain areas much more densely than others. Part of that's historically segregation. Other reasons for that as well. So, and then we don't have these numbers for citizen voting age, but just total population. I want to make sure we include. These are from the census, not the current, not the Department of Finance. But American Indian and Alaska Native, is 0.4, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander is 0.4. Okay, and then just really quickly, when we talk about at a lower, smaller level geographically, we think about census tracts. We have about 9,100 census tracts. Annie, thank you for this data, these tables. 9,100 census tracts in the state of California. If we think about at that level, the percent that is each group. So you see here, these are majority, we're talking about majority. So the percent of each census tract, that is the majority of each of these groups. Let me just walk you through it. So the majority of the percentage or proportion of census tracts that have a majority Asian American is 4.9 or 448, and if we look at just count. Black is 0.5, Latino 31, and white 31. And that's majority. If we look at plurality, again, this is just to give you a little bit of a sense, right? So now this is the percentage of census tracts where each group has a plurality, right? So they're the most dominant, but they're not a majority. So 10% of census tracts, plurality, if I can say it today, Asian American, 1% Black, 42% Latino, 45%, if you will, white. So at a local level, right, the diversity that we have in our wonderful great state, right, can vary quite significantly. And it shows you also the challenges, right, when we're talking about redistricting and representation. Okay, are there any questions other? I'm gonna move over to Christian, just wanna make sure. I threw that at you. Again, just to kind of set the stage a little bit, kind of wet our, yeah. All right. Christian, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, everybody. I'm Christian Grose, and thanks for coming. And I'm going to talk a little. I'm a professor of political science and public policy at USC. I'm Mindy's colleague. I've written a lot about redistricting over the course of my career, the last 20 years as an academic. I've also done a lot of stuff like a report that I want to talk about that I did in partnership with the League of Women Voters and Common Cause that I'm going to talk about during this presentation about the commission process in 2020 with some ideas for ways that could be improved for the next decade and things that worked really well. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, there's my email. I did not bring any cards, but you're welcome to get in touch with me. Mindy already talked about what is redistricting. We know that, so I'm going to skip through some of that. But what I've started studying and what I wrote this report about is the California Independent Redistricting Commission. There's a picture of the 14 members of the commission this go-round who are serving right now, but who served starting in 2020, presenting their maps at the state capitol. What do people think about this? I did a poll in 2020 of California voters asking, this was prior to the selection process, during the selection, what do people think of the commission? Brief description of the commission, who's selected, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 4 no party preference. It's pretty popular. 65% of California voters rated it as fair. It's more popular among Democrats than Republicans. And that's pretty common. In any time a state is one party dominant, when you ask about an institutional mechanism, the out-party voters don't like anything, and the in-party voters tend to like things a bit more. But even among Republicans, 50% thought it was fair, and 70% of Democrats thought it was fair. And then I'm updating this survey down for later in another poll. All right, there's several laws that govern California redistricting that are worth thinking about. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I think it's really important. So the Voting Rights Act is federal, and there are also federal constitutional criteria that prohibit racial gerrymandering. Those two things you have to follow in California and the rest of the country. The Voting Rights Act is set to expire, I believe, right at the next redistricting cycle or right before the redistricting cycle. So I think it's something really important to think about. That I was talking to somebody recently, and we were like, oh yeah, that's happening. That's happening very soon, the expiration. So there needs to be a movement for federal reauthorization or potential changes at the state level among states that are interested in doing Voting Rights Act enforcement at the state level. In California, there's a lot of constitutional and statutory criteria for congressional, state legislative, and Board of Equalization districts. The commission draws those lines. There's the Fair Maps Act for local redistricting in California that goes through rank-ordered criteria that are similar to, they're not exactly the same, as the state constitutional criteria that local jurisdictions have to follow. And then there's the California Voting Rights Act, which is only for jurisdictions that use at-large elections, not those that draw districts. All right, so I've done some research. I've been interested in redistricting since I was in college. I grew up in North Carolina, which redistricts about every 2 years, and more or less, we'll see, you know. And I wrote a book about redistricting and race about a decade ago that looks at voting rights and enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, mostly in the South, but also including California. So check this out if you're interested. I'm doing some work now on enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, but with coalition districts with my colleague at UCLA, Natalie Masuoka. We're really interested in how you could enforce the Voting Rights Act in places like California, where there's significant racial and ethnic diversity. So a lot of times with voting rights enforcement and redistricting, think about Alabama or think about places in the South. It's very much a black-white paradigm, 2 primary racial groups. But in California, it's much more diverse, as Mindy already talked about. So we're trying to think of ways to come up with VRA compliance that would incorporate the idea that there's groups that may vote together and there's groups that may vote contrary to one another. So one example of this in the research that I'm doing with Natalie, with Professor Masuoka, is this is Judy Chu's district in Los Angeles. And this is a district that is plurality Asian, but is Asian and Latino majority when you look at multiple racial and ethnic groups. The voting patterns in this district, Asian voters and Latino voters tend to vote for the same candidates of choice from a voting rights perspective. And the non-Hispanic white voters do not always vote for the same candidates. And so this is a district that even though it was not drawn for voting rights purposes, it was drawn for communities of interest purposes, you could make a case that there's a coalition of Asian and Latino voters in this district that under a more flexible coalition district way to enforce the Voting Rights Act would be something that would be justified. And so federally, circuit courts have come down two different directions on this, and I talk about this in the report. Some circuits, Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, say that this coalition district is required under the Voting Rights Act. Other districts say it's not. The district that covers California has not weighed in on this question. All right, and then many of you who follow redistricting are probably familiar with this, but the most important thing you need to know about federally is the case Milligan versus Allen that was based on Alabama this past summer. This is the map that was ruled unconstitutional by a lower court, and then the US Supreme Court surprisingly upheld it. And so as long as the Voting Rights Act federally exists for the next decade, these sort of maps will continue to be illegal. All right, the other research I'm doing before I get into the report is I'm looking at how to measure communities of interest. Communities of interest is a criterion in the state constitution for congressional, state legislative, and Board of Equalization districts. It's also a criterion in local redistricting in the Fair Maps Act. And so I have a research project looking into how to measure that. I think there's top-down and bottom-up ways to measure it. The bottom-up metric is when people testify to a commission or to a jurisdiction and say, this is my community. And then the top-down is taking some objective data that's geographic and then overlaying that on top of jurisdictions. And so I'm working on that too. All right, so policy. What do I think is important in terms of policy? So I partnered with the League of Women Voters and Common Cause to write a report called Fair Maps in the State of California that looks back at the redistricting process in 2020 with the idea of thinking about policy reforms and ideas for the future and for the next redistricting commission. And I'm going to end my talk today talking about that. In the main part of the report, there's a lot in there. It's very dense. It's the kind of thing that, redistricting nerds love. But, if you want something specific, it's probably in there. There's a lot going on, so I'm not going to cover everything today. But the main thing is what worked and what didn't. And so I hit some of the highlights of things that worked really well. The maps were unanimous. 14 members voted for the maps. There was consensus in ways that we hadn't seen in the previous decade. It was near consensus in the previous decade. There were a lot more challenges. There were staffing and outreach and onboarding challenges that I talk about in the report. And thinking about next time, those are worth looking at. All right, so some of the key recommendations, though, in the report on California, I do want to highlight. There's a lot more in the report, which is linked here if you want to take a look. But the first two I look at are related to map making. And the other thing I should mention before getting into the recommendations is this report was based on viewing hours of the meetings and interviewing 50 plus stakeholders from commissioners to advocacy groups, elected officials and others. And so listening to their inputs and then trying to summarize some of the ideas that came out of that. But the two top line recommendations on mapping that the 2020 Commission, I think, made a mistake with, and the 2010 Commission also did the same thing, was to not focus on Southern California early. There's a focus in 2020 on areas sort of in Northern California that were less challenging to draw, that then hemmed people in on what they could potentially do in Southern California. Half of the state's population lives below, if you do LA County, Riverside County, San Diego County, and so on, so Southern California, and especially LA County, if you wait till too late to work on that, it's gonna be a problem. And the Redistricting Commission in 2020 did not spend as much time on that early on in the process, and then it led to having to redo some things later on in the process. So one recommendation for the future commission would just be start with Southern California, go up. I'm not just saying that because I live in Los Angeles, it's just where a lot of people happen to live. It's also a complex area in terms of racial and ethnic diversity and communities of interest too that overlap. So in 2020, every time there's a deadline, but there's a deadline in 2020 to get the maps done. And if there was a concern that they simply would not have finished, or more likely is that they would have finished, but they would not have done the due diligence to examine communities of interest testimony that came in, many of which was from Southern California and Los Angeles County, or would not think about potential voting rights enforcement issues in parts of Southern California, including Los Angeles, but also including San Diego. So that's one thing, is just basically next time, pay attention to Southern California first, and then go up. I'm not saying that Sacramento, the Bay Area, et cetera, aren't important, but that would be one. The other recommendation that 2020 did well is they had live meetings. They're live meetings all the time. Christian right here was the one that ran all of them or most of them. And so that's new because of Zoom, because we're in the pandemic, but it's really nice for localities, the next state commission, to continue to have that where people can just sit at home and watch the meetings, in addition to having in-person public testimony that could be done. And so that's really good. The more you can have live line drawing and you can have actual Zoom meetings that are in addition to in-person meetings, even post-pandemic, would be helpful. All right, a couple other things, and I already alluded to this, but there's some recommendations in the report about voting rights and then communities of interest and race. Again, because the state is so diverse, racially and ethnically, it's really important to think about this, especially given the potential for the Federal Voting Rights Act to expire. I'm not sure if that will, but I'm hopeful that Congress will get their act together and pass an extension to the Voting Rights Act to keep Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in existence. But I think the legislature should codify protections against minority vote dilution into state law. And then it's also really important to think carefully about how the Jingles criteria, which are the criteria used to measure vote dilution, would apply in those coalition districts. So in areas where racial and ethnic groups are not able to reach 50%, but may vote together with other groups, you got to think about that. And I think that's important for the local level too, not just the next state one. And then the other recommendation that may or may not happen at the next time is there's a lot of data on racially polarized voting and voting rights enforcement that are done in closed-door meetings, and they're legally permitted closed-door meetings due to the potential threat of litigation. But it would be helpful, and some of the advocacy groups that I interviewed for the report said it would be helpful to have a little bit more detail on what is being done in terms of the racial polarization analyses and the Voting Rights Act data. And so just having that would be helpful in the future. And then finally, there's a lot more recommendations, but I wanted to hit the top 5. Finally, on the communities of interest side, like I mentioned, there's 2 ways to measure community of interest. One is, here's where pollution exists, and you overlay that on top of district maps. Another one is people call into the commission and they say, my community of interest is the Berryessa community, and I don't want that split into multiple districts. That's a specific neighborhood in the Bay Area that had been split in previous mapping that wasn't this time. And so what would be really helpful from the commissioner standpoint, and so in talking to the commissioners said they were overwhelmed with testimony and they couldn't figure out the low quality from the high quality testimony. And so some way to be able to quantitatively assess what's coming in via public comment could be helpful to a statewide commission that got tens of thousands, almost actually 40,000 public comment submissions, right? And so the commissioners themselves said that would be useful. And even thinking through criteria for how you could take those inputs and then turn them into maps. Okay, and then there's a lot more in the report. I encourage you to take a look. Again, it was with League of Women Voters and Common Cause, and it was a lot of fun to write it. It was really interesting to listen to everyone's inputs during the interviews. There's much that did not make the report that I learned in interviewing people, and I'm happy to chat about too, but thanks.
All right, thank you very much. So we're gonna go ahead and start the panel portion. I'll ask Christian and Helen to come up. Our third panelist is at home ill today, but he kindly sent a video, and so we're gonna just, instead of calling on him in person, I'm gonna call on his video. Again, Christian, Helen, and Helen, I did not mention, but you are the former past president of the California League of Women Voters.
Yes.
And a leading expert in this area for as long as I can recall, and certainly other topics as well under the democracy umbrella in California. What are your impressions of the 2020 California redistricting process?
So overall, I think it was a huge success, and we need to keep saying that, because we have lots of things that we would change, and I don't want to focus. I want to focus and say it really worked super well, and to have a system work the first time is always a good success, but the second time is a real test to say we know it can work, and particularly given the challenges we had this time around. So I'm really excited about that, and then I'm also excited about talking about some of the changes we'd like to make.
So I'm going to move on to the next question.
Okay.
And we'll just show both of his answers
Okay.
together next time.
Okay.
What questions did communities frequently have about redistricting and how the process worked?
So, I mean, I think the biggest question is kind of why? Why do we need to change something? You know, it's okay now. And I think getting beyond that was kind of the big question. And then once it was, you know, why do I need to testify? Why do they need to hear from me about that process? So we did. And those were the two real big questions. And I will say, I mean, I have a quick story about a high school student. Back when we were first passing the redistricting in California, I was working with a high school teacher, and I would present ballot measures. And we'd start with one that we thought the kids were going to get, and one that I was passionate about. And my memory is that marijuana was on the ballot at the same time as the redistricting. And so I talked about the marijuana measure. We talked about that with the kids, and then we talked about redistricting. And I did this in, you know, a 45-minute class period where we talked about all these things. By the end of that period, I had 3 kids in this class, and this was in deep East Oakland, who said, "I'm going to be a commissioner." Now, I did not dissuade them from saying that they needed to have been a registered voter for more years than it was going to be possible. I was like enthusiastic, and yes, come back to me for a recommendation, and I would recommend them. So it is quite possible in a relatively short period of time to take people who know nothing about redistricting and be able to talk to them about why it's important.
Very active in working with community groups across the state, but especially in the Bay Area, so San Francisco, Oakland and Alameda County, San Mateo County, Contra Costa County, and also with some folks in the Central Valley, program coordinator at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, also known as Asian Law Caucus or ALC. Sorry I can't be with you in person today. I am on the tail end of recovering from a very mild COVID infection. So just wanted to play it safe and join remotely. So thanks for your understanding, but really excited to share a little bit about our experiences in the redistricting process in California. So I have some slides to share. So our first question is, what are your impressions of the 2020 California redistricting process? And just to give you a little bit of background, so ALC was very active in working with community groups across the state, but especially in the Bay Area, so San Francisco, Oakland and Alameda County, San Mateo County, Contra Costa County, and also with some folks in the Central Valley to get involved in redistricting, to understand what the process was and how to get involved, and also what the importance was of this all. We also did work with the state level CCRC, and overall we walked away, I would say, at the state level at least, with a fairly good impression of redistricting. While it certainly wasn't perfect, we felt that the CCRC managed its independent redistricting process pretty well and delivered a strong sense of transparency and legitimacy in the process, and really took a lot of time and paid a lot of attention to listening to an immense amount of public feedback. We saw that they engaged thousands of people across the state who delivered public comments or submitted maps or communities of interest. And I think we came away from that experience thinking that this really proved to be a pragmatic model that can work, and that led to fair, viable outcomes and maps that had been drawn in the process that we thought was fair. And it gave us hope that California really is a leader in adopting systems that strengthen our democracy, and certainly compared to many other states in our nation where we continue to see redistricting processes be abused and manipulated. However, that said, we also saw situations in local redistricting that did really concern us, that disheartened us, and where the communities we serve and work with felt upset at how the process went. I'm sure, as most of you know, in Los Angeles and in San Francisco, we witnessed redistricting processes that unfortunately became extremely vicious at times, and sagas that undermined public trust and confidence in the process. Elsewhere, community groups we worked with often felt like their input simply was dismissed or not considered earnestly. And earlier this year, ALC co-published a study alongside California Common Cause, the League of Women Voters, and the ACLU that looked at the highs and lows of local redistricting in California. And this was based on our experience and research in over 100 jurisdictions across the state. I really encourage everyone to check out this report. There are some really, really interesting case studies and lessons. But certainly overall, just a mixed bag in terms of how redistricting went in California in the last couple of years. Definitely some great highs, but also some important lessons and things that hopefully we can do better next time. So the second question is, what questions did communities frequently have about redistricting and how the process worked? And there were a few that came up. We did a lot of community workshops and presentations to folks, as I mentioned, around the Bay Area and even in the Central Valley. And I would say if I were to boil it down to three questions that came up very repeatedly, the first is, why does this matter? How will this impact our lives? How does this affect the other issues that we care about? Redistricting, quite frankly, is something that is honestly pretty abstract. It's hard for most people to grapple with. And certainly in our presentations, a lot of people struggled or had a hard time grasping the connection between redistricting and how the lines are drawn and what outcomes that would lead to on the ground. But when we framed it in terms of how that might impact housing down the line, or public transit issues, or education, or community safety, people really started to understand the importance, and they started to see the connections. And so, really framing it in real world terms, and focusing on why this matters and how this is going to impact people's daily lives, I think is the first most important question to get at. The second one that came up is, what can we do when, unfortunately, inevitably, a map ends up splitting apart our community? And by far the times when we saw interest in redistricting peak was when draft maps were released and threatened to split apart communities. And sometimes we would see public meetings go from 5 commenters to 50 commenters or 100 commenters. Nobody wants to see their community split apart. And the public is very interested in understanding communities of interest and how that is defined, and specifically what legal remedies there are or recourses there are, for example, in the Fair Maps Act, in the ranked criteria, or other local laws, what they say about keeping communities of interest whole, and what defines a community of interest, and what can a community do when a map threatens to split it apart. How should they frame that issue? How should they make their frustrations, their grievances about that, their concerns about that heard? And third, a big question we heard is, when do the new lines take effect? Even among organizations and individuals who are extremely engaged in this space, there was a lot of confusion around what happens once the lines are adopted. People would ask, does my elected representative change immediately? Do they still represent us until the next election? And many of the groups that care about redistricting are also active in other policy areas and have relationships with the elected officials in their area. So they really want to understand how the redistricting timeline works and how it impacts their political representation going forward. So for our third question, I wanted to talk a little bit about outreach methods that we've seen work in terms of engaging historically marginalized communities of color, young people, low-income communities in the redistricting process, and what challenges there are to engagement. And I'll start this question with actually a little story. Earlier this year, ALC worked with community groups in Pleasant Hill, as the photos earlier showed. Their diverse working class community had never in the history of the town been represented on the city council. They never had anybody from their community, from their neighborhood, ever get elected or ever even run, actually. These are communities that felt very disenfranchised in the political process in their town. And so when they heard about the fact that the city was moving from at-large to district elections for the very first time, they wanted to make sure that their voices were heard in this process. And they reached out to us to learn about how this process was going to work and if we could sort of give them a little bit of technical support. Technically, this is districting, not redistricting, because it was the first time that the city council was engaging in this type of exercise, but sort of this similar framework or similar lessons that we learned here. And of course, one would expect that, given the historic nature of this transition, this would have been pretty heavily publicized. And yet, that wasn't the case at all. We found that even when we were doing our own research and trying to find as much information as possible, it was very difficult to find any information about this. There were a couple small paragraphs that were buried deep on a city website about this process and how to get involved, but really not much outreach had been done. And so, in the same way that the Voters' Choice Act requires counties to commit to doing robust outreach to the public, including language minority groups and lower propensity voters, we would love to see jurisdictions do the same thing every 10 years when it comes to redistricting, really getting the word out as much as possible. And, in terms of actual strategies, one thing that we see work well is reaching out to trusted messengers. That can be local news outlets and ethnic media outlets, local businesses or community members shop, houses of worship, community festivals, community events, really going to where people are instead of expecting that they all find this information, on some website that very few people are likely to see. Multilingual outreach is a really big part of that. 44% of Californians speak a language other than English at home. California is blessed to be such a diverse state, and that really, I think, emphasizes the importance for jurisdictions to make these materials translated and multilingual in languages that are spoken widely in their area. And it's important for those jurisdictions to also create opportunities for members of the public to participate in those languages, at, say, a city meeting, at a public hearing, so that their input can also be heard. Because we have seen many people want to be involved. Here's a photo from one of our local redistricting 101 workshops at a Cambodian community meeting in Oakland. And we saw a lot of people really want to get engaged, but those language barriers were real, and one of the reasons why people felt hesitant about participating in this process. Of course, all of this requires adequate funding, adequate staffing of government offices, and that's something that hopefully can be resolved or addressed at the state level. We also don't have to reinvent the wheel. Nonprofit organizations already have deep community ties and can serve as networks and channels for getting the word out. So local government agencies are certainly not alone in this. Nonprofit organizations like ALC, like many other civic engagement groups, really enjoy helping out and empowering communities with this information. So relying as much as possible on the infrastructures that already exist is important. And then finally, in terms of this question, I would just stress that designing systems that are inclusive and accessible is really important. I often find that it's largely the same people who are really into redistricting, people with a lot of time on their hands, who are able to come to meetings. And if every single redistricting hearing happens on a Tuesday at 10 a.m. And held at the same place, it's likely that you're probably going to have largely the same people showing up. And varying the time and the place of public hearings and outreach meetings, really does lead to more diverse participation. And so we certainly encourage anyone planning redistricting processes to think hard about, how do we design these processes to be as inclusive as possible for all the different types of people who might want to engage in the process, both in person and virtually, and giving people lots of options to do that.
Okay, we will get to that next question in a moment, but Helen, what about you?
So I'm ditto to all of what Sietse said. I mean, I want to say that, and I want to emphasize too that it's hyper-local. There isn't one thing that's going to fit every community in California. It needs that diversity of ways of reaching out means diversity of that, and those groups, the local groups, those trusted messengers, need to be paid. They're working generally on a shoestring budget, and so they need money in order to be able to staff that kind of work. So we need to figure out how to do that. So it's money, it's hyperlocal, and we need to do it. I would add in there that statewide, we did a great job on outreach during the census, and then those groups disbanded. And so if we can connect the census outreach to the redistricting outreach, and that doesn't mean talk about redistricting when you're doing the census. It means just keep those groups that are active and funded, keep that going, that network going, then into redistricting it so that they pivot at that. Yeah. Okay. Yep.
All right, so question number 4 for our panel, this will be for all 3 of our panelists. I'll actually start with Christian, and then Helen, and then Sietse last to close it out for us. How about that? So, Christian, what are the actions or reforms needed at the state level for, that should say 2023 to 2030, really? And what about the local level, if you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, so I talked about this in the report, and I talked about it a little bit in the presentation, but I do think an emphasis at the state level on voting rights and communities of interest are the key reforms. Starting with communities of interest, this is something that is in California state constitution is not as precisely defined as it is in other states and localities. So if we're thinking about changing the descriptions in legislation at the local level, there's some other places you might look. Ohio has a ballot initiative to create a redistricting commission likely to go on the ballot depending on if they get enough signatures in 2024. They really spell out communities of interest in much greater detail than we do in ours. I think our definition is good. It's not terrible, but there's a lot of vagueness. And I think spelling out a bit more, especially in terms of thinking about communities of color in California and ways that communities of interest may overlap with those constituencies. I think that's something that I think about at the local level and also, the state level. I do think the Voting Rights Act, I thought Milligan versus Allen in Alabama would get rid of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2. So I was like, the state's got to do something as soon as possible, but then that didn't happen. So we have the Voting Rights Act for at least another decade federally. But I do think, California could think about ways to incorporate the jingles criteria. I think there's a misconception among people who are new to this that it's about just drawing a district that's 50% of one racial or ethnic group. That's only step one, right? If the group doesn't vote cohesively or together, that's not doing much and actually could in some ways be packing voters in. I think thinking about are racial and ethnic groups voting contrary to one another, which is currently in federal law, and are they defeating candidates of choice of voters of color? That's the most important thing. So, I really think like putting jingles criteria into the state law, but I would put all 3 in, not something that's just some arbitrary 50% number. That would be something I think is important. And then the local level, I think, just needs more attention. A lot of times things are happening and not, outside of really active legal women voters groups in certain locations. I don't know if we have enough attention on some of the localities.
Thank you. Helen?
So I'm going to first react to what Christian said. And the communities of interest definition in California Constitution is intentionally vague. As we wrote it, we were intentional. We wanted communities to define themselves. And so we left it broad so that you can define your community yourself. And when I do that, I have an example that I use for where I live in Oakland, and I can define myself in a whole variety of different communities, and in fact did when I was doing input to the Redistricting Commission. But I strongly endorse that we need to do something about the Voting Rights Act. I think we need to do something nationally, but if failing that, let's do something in California. So The other thing that I want to talk about, the change that is just kind of a mundane piece of how the commission, when we are going to select a 2030 commission, the process of onboarding them and training them and bringing them up to speed needs to be an intentional training period in which they get to know each other, first of all, because they're going to have to work really closely together for a period of several months, and it's really intense. So let's get to know each other. They need to know about redistricting, and that's the training that the 2020 Commission got was all about redistricting, and then they were thrown to the wolves. But they need to know how to set up the administration. They need to know how to set themselves up as a commission and how to work within the California governmental framework, how all that stuff is gonna work. And that is not particularly sexy, so maybe can be interspersed with some of the training that they do about redistricting because that's more fun. But I think there needs to be a really intentional curriculum that takes them through the steps about what they're gonna do.
Thank you.
For our fourth question, what are the actions or reforms needed at the state level for 2023? And what about at the local level? Well, I'll start with a piece of optimism. We are very hopeful that AB 764, the Fair Maps Act reform that was recently signed into law, will help improve the redistricting process by making it more transparent and accessible and really addressing some of those barriers that I mentioned in the last question. I think we would say the biggest reform going forward that we can take is moving more ambitiously towards independent redistricting. Bills like AB 1248, our organization, alongside many other community groups and good government advocates, is a strong supporter of independent redistricting as something that strengthens our democracy. And we were disappointed that AB 1248 wasn't signed into law this year, but we hope the push for independent redistricting continues in 2023 and beyond in some form, whether that takes the form of statewide legislation or more local laws and reforms. And just to kind of give you a little bit of a story, one of the most frustrating experiences we encountered was in San Mateo County in late 2021. For months, nonprofits, community groups, and independent residents had gotten involved in this process and submitted a number of different map proposals to the county's advisory commission. And ALC wasn't necessarily advocating for one map or another. We were here just to help educate the community about, again, how this process worked and offer some technical mapping support in terms of actually, drawing the maps that people wanted to submit to the board. And groups there mobilized dozens of community members and residents to turn out at a series of advisory commission hearings to make their voices heard. And ultimately, the commission voted to advance 2 of the draft maps that the community had put forward to the Board of Supervisors. And both of them would have, made some changes to the existing supervisorial lines. But according to all, the vast majority of public input at these hearings, people felt like those maps would have more fairly represented the desires of the community and the communities of interest that they had identified. But disappointingly, in the first meeting of the Board of Supervisors, they looked at the maps that they had received from the Advisory Commission, and they effectively threw them both out, very quickly without much deliberation at all, and ultimately unanimously voted to adopt their own map that made minimal changes to their own districts. And I share this anecdote not to, shame this county in particular, but just to exemplify what it was like for community groups who spent so much time and energy getting the public involved, only to find out at the end that incumbent-led redistricting processes often just pay lip service to the idea of democratic participation. And this is far from an isolated incident. Examples like these were quite common across the state, as the report that we co-authored earlier this year highlighted. Examples like these eroded the integrity of the process and reduced the public's trust that their input really mattered. So, just to come back to this idea of independent redistricting, we think that those sorts of reforms would be a major step forward for strengthening California's democracy and making sure that public participation remains the key driver for how lines are drawn in the future.
We need to pass the law that mandates local independent redistricting commissions for medium and large counties and cities. And we were very disappointed. The governor vetoed our bill.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Thank you for being here today, for the conversation, for Zooming in or joining us on Facebook Live. We will make everything today available to you later. So if you've registered, we'll send out a thank you and links to some of the reports that were mentioned today, or to everything that was mentioned today. When the video becomes available, we'll also send that out. It's always available on our website under our events tab. Again, encourage you to share, rewatch, whatever it might be, especially if you're in the audience, you may, it's a little different, right? Seeing it kind of a little closer for Sietse's presentation. So thank you, panel, Christian and Helen and Sietse for Goffard, for your insights, your thoughts, and for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of the day.